Story 1. Jared Fogle was a guest on the morning show Great Day in my hometown of Fresno, California, back in 2008. I won't pretend I knew something was wrong, but he behaved in an unpleasant manner. The combination of our interaction and the way his criminal behavior was revealed makes it clear. Story 2. A girl I used to work with in childcare beat a toddler who wasn't even 2 because the child didn't want a nap. This girl made the poor baby bleed all over her blankets and left a large bruise. The child's mouth was also bleeding. The administration and this woman tried to cover it up. We reported her to Child Protective Services. They came out, but their investigation found no substantial proof that she caused the injuries other than our word. So she was never fired. Video evidence was said to be lost, as the administration claimed it was automatically deleted after 24 hours. So we bullied her and she bullied us. We'd hide her things, and she would stomp down the hall threatening to beat us. One day we kept sneaking by and unplugging her fan, as it was hot in that school with no air conditioning. She lost it, screamed and cried, and took the fan, which was the school's property, to her car to keep it away from us. This woman was unpleasant. She never admitted to beating that baby. Wherever you are, I hope your negative attitude keeps you from getting what you want in life. Story 3. Sean Combs. I was a bellman at a hotel where he stayed while his apartment was getting renovated. Being the worst does not cover it. He is also cheap and does not like dogs. Oh, and Steve Bannon was staying at a different hotel where I used to work. Story 4. I knew a guy in college who thrived on being rude. He would shout insults at people walking by while driving and frequently backed into other cars, then drove off. He also made a bet with someone I knew, claiming he could go into any bar in the city and leave with multiple women's phone numbers. My friend decided to test him. After sitting in the bar for 2 hours, the guy broke down in tears because no women wanted to talk to him. Story 5. My uncle, whom we will call Jed, was my aunt's second husband and a mean, awful person. When my brother and I were kids, our family would visit my grandmother. He and my aunt lived in the basement suite of her house, and we feared him. He would yell upstairs about anything that upset him, which was usually something we kids did. He was a smoker, a drinker, diabetic, and unpleasant to be around at all times. My grandmother told my dad that Jed stole money from her drawer, and my dad nearly lost it. Jed died from cancer, and my dad attended the funeral to support his sister and confirm his death. No one at the funeral had anything nice to say about Jed because there was nothing good about him. My aunt went on to marry a wonderful man who treated my grandmother like a queen during the last years of her life. He gets along well with the entire family, and I'm so glad this third marriage was the magic number. If there is a hell, I know that Jed went there in the express lane. Story 6. As a hospice nurse, one of my patients was a convicted child offender. He was released from prison for hospice care. I treated him like the rest of my patients, but he experienced significant anxiety and terminal restlessness that was difficult to manage. He did not have a peaceful death. Story 7. A man I knew for many years and often played board games with was arrested by the police after being accused of rape by an 18-year-old girl, while he was 42 at the time. He was never charged in that case, but when the police searched his devices, they found thousands of images of child pornography. It genuinely sickens me that I used to spend my leisure time with that individual. Story 8. I negotiate for a living. Publicly traded companies have their share of difficult individuals, but founder-owned businesses can be the worst. I recently negotiated with a man who might be the second wealthiest person in his state. He is not very intelligent and is easily the worst person I have met. He runs his businesses in a manner reminiscent of organized crime. Recently, I confronted him. I have no patience for bullies. He is using all his resources to undermine me. He effectively lost the negotiation when I secured significantly lower rates. I would not be surprised if he tries to harm me. What troubles me is how many people submit to him because of his power and wealth. I simply will not. I have a wife and 5 children. Do your worst. I will not be bullied. Story 9. Former coworker. The man's stories often seem to brag about his inappropriate behavior. I would not be surprised to discover he had committed more serious offenses. I am not naive, having worked in a steel fabrication shop with only men, including many older individuals from Europe. Almost everyone had a negative opinion of this man. He was unpleasant. Story 10. I visited Auschwitz last year, and one of the people in my small tour group was a corporate marketing professional for Kraft and Pringles in the United States. He took business calls throughout the visit. While we walked along the railway tracks, he was on his phone trying to negotiate a deal. He traveled there with a few colleagues, and during the drive from Warsaw, they offered me some Polish snack foods they picked up at a gas station and asked me what I thought of them compared to their company's products. They also watched production line videos of their competitors' manufacturing process for those snacks, critiquing and taking notes, continuing that conversation into our tour of the camp. These individuals were extremely disrespectful and exemplify the type of professional I never want to become in my career. Story 11. My best friend of 15 years was selling child pornography for 8 of those years. I had no idea until he was arrested at our apartment. It was the biggest shock of my life. Story 12. My father. I last saw him when I was 4. He has a troubled criminal record and attempted to harm my mother when I was a toddler. Story 13. An unlicensed foster mother in Colorado sprayed me with a hose in 30-degree weather for stealing a cookie. She was truly sadistic, and I believe she derived satisfaction from torturing others. Story 14. My mother was an alcoholic and a chronic liar. She would abandon her children to feel better about herself. Story 15. A guy moved into the house share where I was living. He would lie about anything and everything, gaslight others, spread rumors, and was generally unpleasant. I had never met such a troubled and disturbed person. He faked a heart attack, knowing I was aware of his heart problem, so I would call an ambulance. When they arrived, they checked him and said he was medically fine. I dislike moving house, but I organized my move quickly this time. Story 16. I was friends with a girl in my freshman year of high school. For the sake of the story, her name is S. I was added to a group chat with a couple of other people I kind of knew through another friend, K. I told S about the group chat and she asked if I could add her too, so the group accepted. A few months later, S started dating someone from the group chat. Our S and R had issues from the start, and I ended up being S's confidant through it all. A few days after Christmas, R texted me saying they wanted to break up with S. I said if they thought that was the best thing to do, then to go ahead. Shortly after that, S claimed that R groped her while they were hanging out and tried to force themselves onto her. The entire group sided with her and we essentially kicked her out. A few weeks later, I was also removed after getting into an argument with S about her next partner. I explained that my experiences in love were different from hers and that my approach would also differ. K remained friends with S for a few more years but eventually left her too after becoming tired of the therapist dynamic. Years later, after all of this had passed, R restarted the group chat without S to reconnect with everyone. R revealed that the allegations of sexual assault made by S were false and that she fabricated the story because she knew R was going to break up with her. R also mentioned they went to therapy for a year afterward to heal from the situation, and their therapist suggested that S was a textbook example of narcissistic personality disorder. That's how I, at 14 years old, navigated being friends with someone with such a personality. Story 17. A high school bully would pick fights with anyone who looked at him. He was a boxer who practiced on the meek until someone shot him after graduation. I have never met anyone worse. Story 18. When I was just starting my career, I had a boss who had just gone through a bitter divorce and disliked all men intensely. I won't list the many terrible things she did, but probably the worst was scheduling me to work on my wedding day. Since I had requested that day off and it had already been approved by another manager, she backed off. I got my revenge a year later when I handed her my 2 weeks' notice. She was upset, as I was an excellent employee despite her treatment, and demanded a month. I said, "If only you had treated me better," and walked out, never going back. Story 19. Santa Claus made all kinds of promises but broke every one. He has an unpleasant odor and poor fashion sense, resulting in an overall traumatic experience. Story 20. My rapist is still with the same woman he was with when he committed that act and has children. This is so scary to me. He told me he was a sociopath. Story 21. My dad wasn't the worst, but he definitely said one of the most shocking things I've ever heard. I found out he was stealing flowers from graves to reuse in his decorating business. This is creepy enough, but when I asked how he could do it, he said, they'd be thrown out anyway. I'm just getting them before the garbage. Story 22. My stepgrandma treated my grandpa horribly during the last 5 years of his life while he had Parkinson's disease. Then she suffocated and murdered him and got away with it. She didn't even come to the funeral and changed the will 2 months before he died. So our family received nothing. Story 23. My husband's stepfather sexually abused multiple children, including my sister-in-law. He was a terrible person, and when he died, we rejoiced. It was a great day. My former best friend's dad sexually abused her and regularly raped her brother, as well as several of our friends. He was truly a wolf in sheep's clothing. He died, and I suspect it was in pain. Good. Story 24. There is always this question regarding truly horrendous human beings: nature versus nurture. After working in the field of criminal justice and corrections for decades, I believe the most evil, dangerous, and frightening person I ever encountered was a man on New Jersey's death row. He had been incarcerated since he was 11 years old, except for a year or two. He even murdered another inmate on death row. His name was Ambrose Harris, and he terrified everyone. Story 25. A coworker at a job I held for less than a year was a sales representative. He was speaking with the sales engineer while in his car in Atlanta. They were making plans to visit a strip club that night. He bragged about taking a senior client, likely a vice president, to the same strip club and that they had pictures and evidence. This was clearly bribery and blackmail. They invited me to join, but I declined. Story 26. He was a prolific liar, thief, and what I suspect to be a covert narcissist. I found out that after we broke up, he stole money from all his friends and his grandmother. It wasn't just $20 here or there. It was a couple of hundred from each friend and thousands from his grandmother. Story 27. My maternal grandmother perpetuated the intergenerational abuse. My mother fortunately broke that pattern, but my aunt still victimized her own daughter and niece. I hope those enabling individuals are receiving the karma they deserve in the afterlife. Story 28. My mother came to my hospital room after I gave birth to tell me that my baby, who was in the neonatal intensive care unit, was going to die and that it would be punishment from God for marrying someone of a different race. Story 29. My grade 10 English teacher called us stupid to our faces and to her former students. She also made many students cry, causing people to switch classes within the first week. Story 30. My ex-best friend. I was going through a miscarriage, and she told me that it happens to many women, so I shouldn't be bothered. Story 31. My ex used and discarded me for someone else. My emotions were exploited, and I was fully taken advantage of, something he could not admit. Story 32. Sadly, for me, it's the worst person I've never met. A president of a country in North America who hopes to destroy another country. Story 33. A child rapist. I am happy to say I only knew him for about 30 minutes. After that, he was arrested and the women were freed. I have repressed many of those memories, and I barely remember what he looks like. However, I now have post-traumatic stress disorder from the experience, so it's not that I am complaining. Story 34. David West murdered his girlfriend's parents when she asked him to, in Houston, in the early 80s. Story 35. My ex is the worst person I have ever met. I was young and naive, and I didn't see through his facade at first. He is truly malicious, and I wish I had been smarter to recognize his deception. Story 36. It's a tie between my ex and the individual my mother dated when I was a child. My ex was abusive, and the individual liked to harm other children. Story 37. Michelle is my coworker. She has a princess mentality and believes she is never at fault. When called out for her actions, she becomes defensive and blames others. She claims that people are picking on her when they point out her mistakes. My supervisors hesitate to confront her because she reacts aggressively. She never takes accountability for her actions. Story 38. Jared Fogle and I worked out at the gym. I spoke with him for hours on the treadmill. Story 39. I witnessed a man who boasted about cheating on his wife and then physically assaulted her when she attempted to leave. He did this in front of his friends and laughed when she cried. The last time I saw her, she was still with him after more than 20 years. Story 40. A serial killer and a wife-beating murderer. Michael Swango, a serial poisoner and serial killer. Then there was a junkie who stabbed his wife, my former coworker, to death on a sidewalk, leaving their daughter to cry alone all night next to her mother's dead body. Of the two, the junkie remains my nightmare fuel. Story 41. An ex-coworker from my time at a grocery store is someone I am ashamed to admit I enjoyed working with because he seemed so friendly. I was shocked when he was arrested for child molestation. He is one of the reasons I believe that no one truly knows anyone. However, it makes sense why his girlfriends were always younger than he was. He never stated their ages but mentioned that they shopped at Claire's. I still don't trust him. Story 42. A client in my previous career was a developer and lawyer, and he was the worst. He managed to cheat us out of most of our fee. Story 43. My husband's ex-wife is mentally and physically abusive, manipulative, controlling, and lies about everything to make herself look good. She is jealous and uses the children as tools. Story 44. To be honest, my mother-in-law has a tendency to be the other woman. She shows no compassion for the two families she has disrupted and is unfaithful herself. Even at 57 years old, she continues to cheat. Story 45. There was a student named TJ at my old high school who was the most ignorant and prejudiced person I encountered. He would give absurd reasons to justify his offensive claims and often blamed others for being offended by his words. He claimed that Jewish people were not worthy of respect because they did not believe in God. He claimed that Muslims were terrorists. He said that Spanish and Mandarin Chinese were the same language because he considered them gibberish. He claimed that Japanese people were aliens because they did not have what he considered normal eyes. He asserted that people outside of America were not normal. He claimed that Mexicans existed only to do children's homework and that everyone should just hire one. He insisted that it was others' faults for being upset by his comments, arguing that we were in the wrong for attempting to infringe on his right to free speech. That's just what I can recall from memory. Story 46. I met Desire Munioniza before he was convicted of mass rape and murder while hiding in Canada under a false identity. It is not every day you meet a Rwandan war criminal guilty of genocide. He is the worst person I have met. Story 47. My last boyfriend's ex was quite challenging. She would lose her temper over the smallest things, often screaming and cursing. She got kicked out of restaurants and bars for starting fights. One time, I went to the emergency room for asthma, and she was supposed to pick up the dog they shared for a walk. Since I was in the emergency room, my boyfriend told her not to come by, but she could have him the next day. She reacted by saying, "Serves the fat person right. All overweight people have asthma." She also searched for my name, found my grandmother's address, and threatened to stop by and harm her dog. That's when we obtained a restraining order. I often worried about encountering her at his house. I never met her in person, but I felt relieved when we moved and she didn't know our new address. She truly displayed troubling behavior. Story 48. I worked in a kitchen with a convicted pedophile who had previously appeared in a documentary about such offenders before being hired. I saw him in the news years later when he reoffended. My interactions with him were quite ordinary. He seemed like a typical, weary, blue-collar, middle-aged man. Story 49. My daughter's ex, who has a permanent restraining order against him, is in prison for drive-by shooting. I have never hated someone as much as I hate him. Story 50. My child's first dance teacher lied about the safety of the young children in their care and what was really occurring when parents were not present. The dancers, aged 5 to 6 years old, were instructed to lie about what happened in class. This behavior is unacceptable. Story 51. Cameron started off friendly in 7th grade, but he eventually became a bully by high school. He made fun of my hairiness and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Ironically, he was morbidly obese and had severe acne. Story 52. I worked with a man a few years ago who was cheating on his wife, and everyone in the office knew about it. He was having an affair with a store manager from another location. Later, he came into the office upset because he found out his wife had cheated on him once, and he believed that was immediate grounds for divorce. It was remarkable how he couldn't handle what he was doing to others. Story 53. There are some troubling issues here, particularly regarding a former coworker. He was a young Earth creationist who genuinely believed the Earth is 6,000 years old and was not allowed to be in a closed space with a woman alone. He demonstrated his faith by criticizing others and openly telling people they were going to hell if they were not Christian or were gay, while dismissing the work of those individuals. As my direct superior, I spent a lot of time with him and others, often having to apologize for his behavior and returning to bars and restaurants to leave appropriate tips for service staff whom he disregarded. What stood out most was his belief that since he tithed, he could say anything and felt safe. Story 54. I used to work with a man who was very kind. However, he later experienced a severe mental health crisis and tragically took the lives of 3 elderly men. I cannot definitively label him as the worst person, but he did commit an incredibly terrible act. Story 55. Many people I disliked in advertising, but the worst was probably one particular mid-level creative director who combined mindless pretension with an overwhelming fear of his superiors. We often had pre-meetings before our actual meetings to ensure nothing would get him in trouble. To me, part of being the head of a group is to stand up for your team and take the heat when necessary. He was the opposite of that. He was probably not the worst person I ever knew, but certainly one of them, and unbearable to be around. If I was about to run into him on the street, I would step into traffic to get away, regardless of what was coming down the road. Story 56. Ted Cruz is the worst person I have ever met, and I have met some of the other people mentioned in this thread. Story 57. My ex's mother was a narcissist. She often talked about suicide, which she had attempted when my ex was a child, to manipulate him into doing what she wanted. She frequently reminded him of how much she did for him, accusing him of being ungrateful for her sacrifices. She would call her ex-husband, who has been happily married and had more children, and belittle him, saying he would always be useless and beneath her status. When he did not answer the phone, she would call her sons to complain about their father, claiming she was worried something might have happened to them. She treated me like a maid, her staff like slaves, and believed everyone was incompetent. Story 58. She was the manager of a nursery where I worked for only 4 months, and it was enough to be traumatizing. She made me cry on my second day of work just because I was relaying information that a parent had shared with me. She was a horrible person. Story 59. Colonel Wardak, he deserves the worst for his actions. I hope he faced consequences during the Taliban takeover, but I doubt it. Story 60. A former Navy SEAL stole some intellectual property from me. Interestingly, a former abuser of women forced him to confess. Story 61. Almost everyone I attended high school with were self-centered individuals from affluent backgrounds. Story 62. My aunt and uncle had a neighbor whom they later discovered was a predator. This individual ended up in the news for molesting several girls before he was caught. Unfortunately, he was skilled at manipulating people. The lengths he went to were alarming. He engaged in charity work and presented himself as exceptionally kind. He ingratiated himself with my aunt and uncle to gain access to my cousin. He also built trust with other family members, particularly my other aunts and uncles, who thought he was fantastic. Thankfully, nothing happened to their kids. He owned a business and offered discounts to my family. He successfully gained the trust of many people in his community. Story 63. I honestly don't think I can answer this. I've met so many absolutely horrible people and even called some of them friends back in the day. But I will say that I wasn't too fond of Mickey Mouse. He refused to sign my shoe at Disneyland when I was a child. Story 64. Walter Koenig shoulder-checked a friend of mine and didn't even apologize, he just kept going. So yes, goodbye Chekhov. It's no wonder that Babylon 5, was the only work you found afterwards. I'm pretty sure you're the next one to go, as we all know Shatner and Takei want to outlast each other by being the last one remaining. Story 65. My ex took advantage of a homeless teenager and made me completely dependent on him. He tried to manipulate me into having a child despite being unfaithful. Story 66. My wife's aunt's husband, Steve, is the biggest narcissist and jerk. The business went under, and he blamed his wife, who was the only one working there. Story 67. Basically, she is the real-life version of Liz from Gilmore Girls. Her husband resembled TJ, but at least TJ was actually likable. Story 68. My uncle did a lot of horrible things and spent 30 years of his life until death sitting alone in a very small prison cell. Story 69. The other me, I know what he can do and what he's capable of. So far I've managed to keep him restrained. Story 70. My ex-husband had a best friend. I never liked him much. He was the opposite of anything I would like. A drug user and an animal abuser. Not serious enough for legal action but enough to make you dislike him quickly. I never liked the guy and just tolerated him. He claimed to have many life stories and significant past events, and of course lots of problems. Then a family member revealed that none of that ever happened at all. We're talking about major surgeries, accidents, everything. He was also in serious trouble with the law for substantial retail theft at his workplace. Thank goodness my then current husband said no and cut him off. He tried to plead his case, but absolutely not. The entire situation was based solely on lies. He has left the state, and I feel sorry for his new community. Story 71. Working in media, anyone I met who has a reputation for being difficult is always pleasant to work with. Except for Bill Nye. Story 72. A local realtor who deceived my wife and me out of a deal has been known to do this for many years to various people. 15 years later, he needlessly instigated an argument with me and a coworker, as we worked for the local government and were genuinely trying to help him. At one point, he got uncomfortably close to my face and said, "Your dad would be embarrassed by you." My dad and I were very close until he passed away from cancer. Had my coworker not intervened, I might have faced serious consequences. Story 73. My abusive ex-husband. The worst part is having to co-parent with him, attending events where he acts like he has never done anything wrong. Meanwhile, I carry the scars that prove otherwise. It is utterly soul-crushing. Story 74. Reese Witherspoon. Her America's Sweetheart act is just that. She is snobbish, rude, and self-centered. Story 75. I have been fortunate not to encounter too many unpleasant people in my life. The worst, which are mild compared to the stories here, were individuals I met at work. My former supervisor, who recently retired, was simply a difficult person. I could share many stories, but this one best summarizes my experience. A couple of years ago, I faced some hard issues along with related health concerns. It wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it was a bit scary as the cardiologist was concerned and wanted to conduct further testing. Consequently, I had to leave the office an hour or two early on about 6 different days over 2 months to undergo the additional testing. I didn't want to take time off for this, as it was at most 2 hours and really not worth taking an entire day or even a half day of vacation. It truly had no negative impact on my work, as I was able to plan around it. My immediate supervisor was understanding and said, "No issue. Just let me know when you have to leave early." After the third appointment, my former supervisor noticed I had left early a few times. He asked my supervisor what was going on, and my supervisor was honest, saying, "Pascal is having some heart issues and is getting checked out by her cardiologist." That should have been the end of it, right? No. My former supervisor decided to approach my office and said, "Pascal, I notice you keep leaving early. Your supervisor tells me it's because of medical appointments. You really need to schedule those appointments outside of business hours." He was entirely serious. After I picked my jaw off the floor, I replied, "Listen, when someone is having heart issues, they follow the cardiologist's instructions, not your directives. If you want to discuss this further, I'm happy to have a meeting with human resources present, and we can all determine the best way to proceed." He backed off after that because he understood that human resources would tell him to stop immediately. That reflects the kind of person he was. Goodbye. He is gone and not missed. The other unpleasant experience was with another supervisor. She made Miranda Priestley look warm, fuzzy, and nurturing. I lasted 9 long months at that job. I found another position, gave my 2 weeks' notice, and literally skipped out of the office on my last day, feeling as if a 1,000-pound weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I never looked back. Story 76. My late father's wife. On the day of his funeral, she blocked all of his family members from his Facebook page. Luckily, she left me and my grandmother out of it. He had a brother and sister, along with many nieces and nephews. We were then shamed by her family for exposing the truth and were deemed unchristian for speaking out. I wish I could make this up. Story 77. I had 2 friends in 2022 who were the worst people on the planet. They acted nice, but they were unpleasant. If I saw them today, I would confront them. Story 78. My ex is a pervert who is now on a sex offender registry for something horrible he did. He was a manipulative, womanizing cheater who targeted vulnerable women to get what he wanted. Story 79. Please believe me, I had the displeasure of running into her twice, and she was awful both times. She shot me a nasty look for no reason when I was near her, and a few years later, when some fans asked for an autograph, she gave them the same nasty look and rolled her eyes. Parker Posey. Story 80. It's a tie between my former bosses from Target and my ex from 2 years ago. Apparently, the word is that he teamed up with them to prevent me from getting a job and finding a new boyfriend. Story 81. My biological mother is abusive, neglectful, narcissistic, a pathological liar, and a con artist. She is truly the worst in every way. Story 82. The woman I worked under during the summer as a camp counselor was a horrible person. She treated the kids poorly and me as well. She did not care about the children and constantly ordered me around. One day I had enough and reported her neglect to the management. They took this very seriously, and during a camp outing with all the staff and children, they showed up and handed her termination papers. She did not take it well and tossed the papers before storming off. It was a good day. Story 83. Not a specific person, but as someone who lives in the Deep South, the most hateful and self-absorbed people I have encountered have all been Christians. This is not to say that all Christians are awful, but the South seems to breed a particularly negative version of them. Story 84. Dick Cheney gave me a medal. I am 6 feet 4 inches tall, and there is absolutely no way that he is 5 feet 8 inches as his biography states. He is 5 feet 4 inches at most. He essentially ran Ronald Reagan's administration and both George Bush administrations as well. Story 85. My first ex, Tumitz, was so innocent when I met him, but he twisted my thoughts and caused me a lot of trauma. I regret getting to know him. He even spoke poorly of me to his friends, who are also my former friends, and to my family. He had the audacity to create a fake account to chat with my family and tarnish my image. Story 86. I met an unpleasant Israeli man while working at a neighborhood festival. He was a total stranger, and I will never see him again, but his rude personality lingers in my memory. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.